While most players think they've explored the entirety of Baldur's Gate 3, there are 9 spells that I can guarantee you haven't used. That's because these 9 spells only exist in the game files as images and didn't make it into the final release of the game. But why not? Let's take a look at what these spells are and maybe we can piece together why they didn't make it into the game. First up is Magic Jar. Magic Jar lets you possess any NPC's body that fails a charisma saving throw. This spell puts your body into a catatonic state as your soul leaves and enters a container. While your soul inhabits the container, you are aware of your surroundings as if you were in the container's space. The only action you can take is to project your soul up to 100 feet out of the container, either returning to your body or attempting to possess a humanoid's body. You can attempt to possess any humanoid within 100 feet that you can see, and the target must make a charisma saving throw, and if they fail, your soul moves into the target's body and the target's soul becomes trapped in the container. Now, on a success, the target resists your efforts to possess it, and you can't attempt to possess it again for 24 hours. And once you possess a creature's body, you control it, and the possessed creature's soul can perceive what's going on from the container using its own senses, but cannot move or take any actions at all. Sounds like torture. While possessing a body, you can use your action to return to your host body to the container if it's within 100 feet of you, returning the host creature's soul to its body. If the host body dies while you're in it, then the creature dies, and you must make a charisma saving throw against your own spellcasting DC. On a success, you return to the container if it's in 100 feet of you, otherwise you'll die too. If the container is destroyed or the spell ends, your soul immediately returns to your body, and if your body is more than 100 feet away from you, or your body is dead when you attempt to return to it, then you die. So there's a lot of different things that can happen, and I think that this is an absolutely crazy spell that could be a lot of fun to use, but it's also, in my opinion, a bit of a confusing spell. You need to keep track of where's the container, whose soul is inside of it currently, am I within 100 feet of my body, just in case the container gets destroyed or the possessed humanoid dies, and so on. So while it's a very clever and cool spell, I can absolutely see why this spell didn't make it into the game because of its complexity. Also, being able to have someone control an otherwise non-player character, I'm sure opens up a can of worms in terms of exploits, bugs, and things that the developers would have to account for. But if you're enjoying this video so far, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe because I've got some awesome Baldur's Gate 3 videos coming out and you're not going to want to miss them. Number 2 is Mending. Mending repairs a single break or tear in an object you touch, such as a broken chain link, 2 halves of a broken key, a torn cloak, or a leaking wineskin. As long as the break or tear is not larger than 1 foot, you can mend it, leaving no trace of former damage. This spell can physically repair a magical item or construct, but the spell can't restore magic to such an object. So this spell is interesting to me because I can't really think of very many uses for it. Now, from the sound of it, you could probably mend the club of Hill Giant Strength back into the stool of Hill Giant Strength, or maybe if Bernard was dismembered, you could put him back together again. But it seems to me perhaps the reason it was never implemented was because its uses would be few and far between. And in cases where we have things like the Vision of the Absolute, the spear broken in two, you can just right click and hit combine rather than use the spell Mending. And other objects like Morning Frost Staff, again, you can just right click and combine instead of needing the Mending spell. It's much simpler that way, I think, because I don't think there's enough options for Mending to necessitate really bringing this spell into the game. And number 3 is Levitate. Levitate makes a creature or object hover in the air up to 20 feet, being able to move only by pushing or pulling against a fixed object or surface within reach. The spell can levitate a target that weighs up to 500 pounds. An unwilling creature that succeeds on a Constitution saving throw is unaffected. This spell is pretty neat, and it can really allow you to reach places you wouldn't otherwise be able to. The 20 feet limitation, though, could stop this from being as useful as Featherfall, which is the go-to spell for jumping down from high places without using a spell slot. However, Levitate does allow you to also go 20 feet upwards, but Enhanced Leap can also do this for you, and that's a ritual spell. So while Levitate is a cool spell, I think Enhanced Leap and Featherfall help with getting around. If you wanted to use Levitate to crowd control an enemy, so just levitate them so that they're helpless, there are other options in the game. In fact, there are plenty of crowd control other options in the game, so I can see why this spell in particular did not make it into the final game. And number 4 is Identify. Identify lets you learn all properties of an item, including how to use it or what spell created it. You choose one object that you must touch throughout the casting of the spell. If it's a magic item or other magic imbued object, you learn its properties and how to use them, whether it requires attunement to use, how many charges it has, and you also learn whether spells are affecting the item and what they are, and you also learn if the item was created by a spell, which spell created it. So this spell sounds really, really cool. You could learn so much about the items you find throughout the world, but like some of the other cut spells, I imagine that essentially doubles the amount of content in the game. Now every item needs to have a backstory, additional details when it's identified, who created it. There's just so much that it would add to the game, so I can absolutely see why cutting identify from the game was probably a good choice in order to cut down on so much content that would come from players who want to identify every single item. And number 5 is comprehend languages. This spell lets you understand, speak, and read any language. For the duration, you understand the literal meaning of any spoken language that you hear. You can also understand any written language, but you must be touching the surface on which the words are written. This spell doesn't decode secret messages. So this is one I would be interested to see because I'd love to read what the Illithid manuscript says on the Nautiloid. But other than that, I can't really think of many other languages or text that aren't legible by the player. So I'd actually say the spell has the opposite problem as identify. There probably aren't enough use cases for it to justify being in the game, perhaps. And number 6 is Arcane Eye. This spell creates an invisible flying eye that lets you receive visual information from a safe distance. This sounds very familiar to Scrying Eye. However, the Arcane Eye is invisible, which is much better in my opinion considering how fragile the eye is. Now as a player spell, I could see this being very useful, letting you scout ahead, getting ready for ambushes, but with the camera only being able to go so far away from other party members without forcing a short load time, it might not lead to the best player experience, constantly forcing those load times as a condition to scout ahead with this spell. Also, it's so similar to Scrying Eye that it seems to me there just wasn't a need, and giving NPCs a non-invisible Scrying Eye is much better than an invisible Scrying Eye if you ask me, so I can totally see why Arcane Eye didn't make it into the game. And number 7 is True Seeing. This spell gives you True Sight, a condition that lets you see through every illusion, magical disguise, invisibility, or shapeshifter's true forms, as well as notice secret doors hidden by magic. This spell sounds incredibly powerful considering all of the applications. There are a lot of illusion doors in Baldur's Gate 3 and shapeshifters hiding their true form, whether it's druids or Orin. This spell may just be too powerful, and that's why it was removed. Discovering hidden doors could just be solved every time by using True Seeing, and items like the Whispering Mask just wouldn't have any use. And personally, I love Whispering Masks. I think that's so much fun. Also, True Seeing seems like a much better version of See Invisibility, so with this spell in the game, it would probably make See Invisibility irrelevant. So I could see why it didn't make it into the final version. And number 8 is Magic Circle. This spell creates a circle that keeps certain types of creatures from entering it. There are image files for certain types of creatures, for example, Magic Circle Elemental, Magic Circle Fiend, or Magic Circle Undead. So you get to choose one or more of these creature types, and the circle prevents that type of creature from entering the circle. If one of the said creatures tries to use teleportation or other magical travel to enter, like Misty Step, it must first succeed a charisma saving throw. The creature has disadvantage on attack rolls against targets within the circle, and targets within the circle can't be charmed, frightened, or possessed by the creature. Now, when you cast this spell, you can elect to cause its magic to operate in the reverse direction, preventing a creature of this specific type from leaving the circle and protecting targets outside of it. So it's almost like you're trapping said creature inside of it, which sounds very powerful. Now, in order to cast the spell, you do need certain reagents. You need to either have some holy water or powdered silver, of which only holy water is in Baldur's Gate 3. So I think it's really cool that certain powerful spells would have a reagent requirement. I think that also makes sense for role-playing purposes. This spell's uses are limited though, in my opinion. It can really only help against those 3 creature types, elementals, fiends, or undead, and while it would probably get a ton of use in Act 2, I can actually see the spell being probably too powerful. I mean, a magic circle undead placed in a doorway completely protects your party from melee undead, which are much more plentiful than their ranged counterparts. So I think the reason Magic Circle probably didn't make it into the game, probably because I think it's too strong. And finally, number 9 is Dispel Magic. This spell lets you target a creature, object, or magical effect, and any spell of a 3rd level or lower immediately ends. According to Sven Vink, the Baldur's Gate 3 developers tried to make Dispel work for a very long time, but they had to get rid of it because it would have doubled the size of the game. Now I imagine that if you dispel a certain spell, it would have certain animations, perhaps a consequence for each spell, and that's a lot of work to make that for every single spell that can be dispelled, which would then accordingly double the size of the game. Also, magical effects throughout the game that require arcana checks to identify would probably also be able to be dispelled, which would mean more dialogue for each character that is either freed from magic, or maybe you dispel an illusion and characters are reacting to it, and so on. So I can really see how Dispel Magic would really expand the size of the game. Interestingly enough, the icon for this spell still exists in the game, but is used for Unshackling Strike, which is a weapon action, and the icon artwork is very similar to the Dispel Magic icon in Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, and is even labeled Spell Abjuration Dispel Magic within the game files. And those are 9 spells that didn't make it into Baldur's Gate 3. Let me know why you think these spells didn't make it into the game, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.